eager to share with you Psalm 59. It's a remarkable psalm after the violence of yesterday, which is still a bit troubling to me in terms of the close of that psalm. This one has a unique statement regarding one's foes. We'll see it in a moment, but I want to flag it as a distinctive quality to this psalm. Psalm 59, verse 12 says regarding the foe, "Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Make them wander by your power and pull them down, our shield, my supreme." And so here, distinctly in Psalms, there is a plea to God not to kill. Usually that's what you do, in the Psalms with a foe. So hold on to that as something distinctive to this Psalm. We'll come back to it when we read it, though I will flag that only two verses later, verse 14 begins, "Consume and rage." And we'll deal with the tension between "do not slay" and "consume and rage" and how that gets parsed. The other thing that's distinctive about this psalm is this reference to a dog, in that the exact same verse will get repeated. A verse that reads, verse 7 and then verse 15, "They return toward evening. They howl like the dog and prowl the city." And I'm really struck by that verse, why it's repeated, and the variety of translations. I'll share with you. I always love these examples. There's always a little piece of me that still needs to prove that a translation is an interpretation, that every translation is, if you will, a piece of the translator, not only the text. And last, Psalms 57, 58, and 59 are linked by the opening, which is Al Tashchet, "do not destroy." Some say it's the name of an instrument that is mournful. But they all deal with distinct moments in David's life. And this one is the earliest of those moments of these three Psalms, and among the most suitable for film. They're all suitable for film, in that David led such a turbulent life. There's a lot of tension, a lot of drama. So with that as some of the introduction, let me put up Psalm 59. Those who know me will know that I was tweaking this still this morning. And I leave you with a question. Here's two questions for our discussion. I'll pace myself. And that is, you'll have a choice whether to call this, regarding dogs, the sound of a dog, growl or howl. That's the first question. And the second is my choice in focusing on that repeated verse as the title, and a sense of the danger that comes with the enemy, that they are like a pack of dogs. Or should I rename it for something like Psalm 12, "Do not slay them, lest my people forget," because that is a distinctive concept. All right, I will go through this. I'll go back slowly to show you some of the artistic weave. I'll particularly focus on those images of the dog and the dog in tradition. And then we'll look, if we have time, at the first book of Samuel, particularly Samuel 19. Psalm 59. For the conductor of Al Tashchet, of David a Michtam, when Saul sent and they watched the house to kill him. Save me from my enemies, my God, from those who rise up against me. Shelter me. Save me from the workers of iniquity, and save from the people of bloodshed. Deliver me. For behold, they lie in ambush for my spirit. Against me gather the mighty. I have not transgressed, nor have I sinned, Adonai. Without iniquity, they rush and prepare themselves, awake to greet me and observe. And as for you, Adonai, God of hosts, God of Israel, arouse to make account of all the nations. Do not show grace toward any iniquitous traitors. Selah. They return toward evening. They howl like the dog and prowl the city. Behold, they bellow with their mouth. Swords are in their lips, for who hears? But as for you, Adonai, you laugh at them. You mock all nations. Mighty One, I watch for you. For God is my shelter. My God of kindness will precede me. God will let me observe my watchful foes. Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Make them wander by your power and pull them down, our shield, my supreme. For the sin of their mouth is the words of their lips, and let them be trapped in their pride, for oaths and lies they tell. Consume in rage, consume that they be no more, that they may know that God rules over Jacob to the ends of the earth. Selah. And they return toward evening. They howl like a dog and prowl the city. They wander for food. If not sated, they may not sleep. But as for me, I sing of your might. I will joyfully sing in the morning of your kindness. For you have been my shelter and a refuge in the day of my distress. My mighty one, to you I will hymn. For God is my shelter, my God of kindness. So, stirring the key themes. Let me point out some of the themes and some of the artistry, and then I'm going to talk about dogs. A key theme here, look at the last verse, is my mighty one. To you I will hymn. And you get that in verse 17. I sing of your might. Might. God is mighty. You get it in verse 10. Mighty one. Uzo, mighty one. And at the same time, as this psalm begins, mighty, azim, the same root, is used for the enemy. They are, if you will, godlike with a small g in their power to terrorize me. So, save me from my enemies, my God. That's a chiasm. So it's verb save, enemies, AB, my God. Enemies, shelter me, BA. See that in 2? And you get the same thing in verse 3. Verb noun, save, A, B, workers of iniquity, and then it flips. People of bloodshed, B, A, deliver me. So A, B, B, A, B, B, A. 4 requests for salvation. And they both start the same way. Hatzileni, Hatzileni, verses 2 and 3. There's this call for being saved. And that call for being saved is matched by a repetition throughout this psalm for seeking from God shelter. So you get the end of verse 2, tisagveni, shelter me. There it's a plea. In verse 10, mighty God, I watch out for you. God is my shelter. Verse 10, a matter of fact. That is, if you will, how I define God. And then that same image, the same word, l'sagev, to shelter, is in verse 17 and 18. So you get ki hayita miskavli, for you have been my shelter. And again, ki Elohim miskabi, in verse 18, because God is my shelter. But here has been a movement through the psalm, a plea for shelter, defining God as a source of shelter. And then at the end of the psalm, verse 17 and 18, a celebration, a thanksgiving of God as shelter. And so there's a movement in this psalm artistically woven. Here's one other thing to note, and that's a sense of twice repeating all the nations. The psalm goes back and forth to feeling personal and then national and even of the whole world. The second dimension in terms of movement in the psalm is that of time. Verse 7 and 15, those images of the dog, as toward evening the dog goes out. Verse 16 refers to not sleeping, an image of night. And verse 17, again, that image of celebration. I will joyfully sing in the morning. V'aranen laboker chastecha, of your kindness. And in verses 17 and 18, there are three different words used to describe song and rejoicing. And so Psalm 59, artistically woven with these sellas at the end of verses 6 and verse 14, being musical notation. A psalm that was sung. And now to focus on verse 7 and then to go beyond it. So they return toward evening. This is again referring to the foe. They howl like the dog and prowl the city. That same line is in verse 15. And they return toward evening. They howl like a dog and prowl the city. And then verse 16 is a bit oblique. They wander for food, or it could be they wander to eat. Im lo yispu'u, if not fed, if not sated, v'yalinu. In my translation, I take the lo, if not, and I put that not for both of the next two verbs, which is a choice. So I do it, if not sated, they may not sleep. But I'm going to read you, because I just love different translations, a number of different translations of 15 and 16, particularly over defining. I asked you to consider howling and growling in verse 15. King James, let them make a noise like a dog. And then later, verse 16, let them wander up and down for meat and grudge if they not be satisfied. Rabbinical Assembly. Again, King James was they make a noise. Rabbinical Assembly is they mutter like dogs. And at the end, if they are not sated till they pass the night. Zalman Schachter Shalomi, his translation, howling like dogs, they'll drift through the town going ravenous and vagrant. JPS, growling like dogs, they wander in search of food and wine if they are not satisfied. So the issue of, is it howling, growling? Is it making noise or muttering? Are all possibilities. And again, that last part, they whine if they are not satisfied, or it can be they are vagrant. As you can see, I translated it with that double not applied to verse 17, to verse 16, if not sated, they may not sleep. So now some comments on dogs and why this image of a dog. It's distinctive also, and I love dogs, and therefore I had, as I shared with you in my introduction to today's reading, an image of being a young teenager in Mexico, in Rocky Point, when it was a much less developed place, some 40 years ago, longer, packs of dogs at night, no collars, wild. And the nature, and it was frightening to me. I'd never seen a wild pack of dogs. And there's the sense of unpredictability and ferociousness, and the image of how dogs will encircle and its potential victim and work collectively. And at night, Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi, will say, it's at night that the dogs howl. And that actually helped influence why I chose howl versus growl. Growl has this image of getting ready to attack, but I like howl because it creates a sense of an unknown trepidation, particularly at night. the image of the pack of dogs is that the enemy, and you'll see even in verse 15, it's in the singular, the verb, they howl. The howling is in the singular, again conveying that it's a pack, it's a collective that is operating together. In the Talmud, in Baba Kama 60b, they'll say that when the angel of death comes, a dog senses it and howls. And so if you hear a dog howling with that image, you have reason to fear death is approaching. There's another comment, and that is in the Talmud in Sota 49a. It says that in the future times, just before the Messiah comes, a time of battles, of Gog and Magog, a time of violence, that generation, quote, its face will resemble a dog's, which I assume signifies that at that time, and that's the image, at least in that description of the battles before the end of days, that there'll be this sense of terror. And a dog in the Bible is often seen as wild and dangerous. Sforno, who's an important Jewish commentator, lives in Italy, 1475 to 1550, he will say that the first reference to the dog, verse 7, is in reference to the psalmist feeling pursued. And here it's David being prophetic. It's repeated on behalf of the nation looking forward to a messianic era. And so there's a journey from his personal danger or the dangers of his time as king in the classic sense of reading a psalm to, at the end, returning to the image of the dog, wandering for food. If not sated, they may not sleep. That's the tribulations before the Messiah. And then 17 and 18 are the rejoicing over a future day. I like dogs, and I am reminded that it's more complicated, and how powerful this image is of the lurking, prowling, howling pack to define an enemy. And now for this last image, verses 12 and 14. Here is this distinctive plea: all to our game, do not slay them. Pen yishkechu ami, lest my people forget. Make them wander by your power, and pull them down, our shield, my supreme. So that seems kind of enlightened. Again, not asking for destruction. It might have an element of preserve them. All the more, and we're going to come back to that story, if this is about King David, and he is being pursued by Saul and his troops, well, that would be a context. As we saw yesterday, and we've seen in reading of David and Saul, David holds back from killing the king because he is God's anointed one. There's a certain respect for God's choice of Saul as sovereign. And so do not slay them, again, as part of that. It can be back to our more recent times, forward to our more recent times, the debate over Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann in the early 60s when he was on trial in Israel. And he's the only person to ever be given the capital punishment in the state of Israel as a person who had crimes against the people. There were many who said, keep him alive, put him in a kibbutz, let him see how the Jews are thriving, and let people come and see him as a living symbol of the horror of the past and our triumph over it. So 12, do not slay them, lest my people forget. But then only 2 verses later, we have verse 14, kalei v'chema, consume, often translated as consume them in rage, But I took out the word them in my translation this morning because it doesn't appear here in the Hebrew. That, again, is an interpretation, because the other way to read 14 is consume their evil doings in rage. It's, in fact, elliptical. It's a gap in terms of what the psalmist, or who the psalmist, is asking God to consume. Consume in rage, consume that they be no more. And they, again, circle they, can either be their evil deeds or can be the enemy. And again, in many, that key word, consume them, is an addition that is widely seen in translations, that they may know that God rules over Jacob to the ends of the earth. I choose here to interpret this all the more because of the historical context, as David saying, do not slay them, instead let them wander. And the image of wandering is that of Cain, right? That's the punishment in the Cain and Abel story. Let them be a living symbol of their wrongdoing to all who see them. So with that, and I keep one eye on the clock, because even a half hour means that I'm often sprinting forward, and I hope it's not going at a sprint pace and you're absorbing the power of this psalm. I'm going to now remove the psalm because I like to see you, and I want to read to you a little bit from 1 Samuel, which this psalm is identified with. You remember how it begins? A michtam, when Saul sent and they watched the house to kill him. And so this is understood as 1 Samuel 19, the young David. Little context, chapter 17, that's the really young David going into battle against Goliath and proving victorious. Yesterday, we met Abner, who was the lead general for King Saul. As David slew Goliath, Saul, the king, will say, who is that boy? And Abner, the general, will go over and say, identify yourself. And in the image at the end of chapter 17, this boy is carrying Goliath's head. And he says, I am your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Now verse 18, chapter 18, right after that. And again, we're headed to chapter 19. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul, that's Saul's son, became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. And then David would become a soldier. He'd go out with the troops in battle against the Philistines, although still quite young. And he became very successful. He became so successful that the people would sing of David songs of his triumph. And Saul said, and they would sing as follows. Verse 7 of chapter 18. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. And then verse 8. Saul was much distressed and greatly vexed about the matter. For he said, quote, to David they have given tens of thousands, and to me they have given thousands. All that he lacks is the kingship. From that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit of God gripped Saul, and he began to rave in the house while David was playing the lyre, as he did daily. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, thinking to pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Danger, a crazy king, a young fighter who plays the lyre, who is pursued by Saul. So Saul says now, again, later in 18, I'm going to marry this young man to my wife, but I'm going to give to my daughter, but I'm going to set him up for a battle that he'll get killed in. So he says First, he's going to give him Meirav. In the interim, Meirav marries somebody else, and Michal, the younger daughter, falls in love with David. So Saul says, okay, David, you can have Michal as your wife if you bring me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Thinking, the text says, verse 25, say this to David, the king desires no other bride price than the foreskins of 100 Philistines as vengeance on the king's enemies, unquote. Saul intended to bring about David's death at the hand of the Philistines, but instead David returns with 200 foreskins. He marries Michal, the princess. And now the story of our psalm, chapter 19. Saul urged his son Jonathan and all his courtiers to kill David. And so David is living with Michal, and Saul sends troops. That night, verse 11 now, Saul sent messengers to David's home to keep watch on him and to kill him in the morning. But David's wife Michal told him, unless you run for your life tonight, you will be killed tomorrow. Michal let David down from the window and he escaped and fled. Michal then took the household idol. And this too I had forgotten. Pause. King David and Michal have a household idol? All right, back to the story. Michal then took the household idol, laid it on the bed and covered it with a cloth. And at its head she put a net of goat's hair. Saul sent messengers to seize David, but she said, quote, he is sick, unquote. Saul, however, sent back the messengers to see David for themselves. Bring him up to me in the bed, he ordered, that he may be put to death. When the messengers came, they found the household idol in the bed with the net of goat's hair at its head. Saul said to Michal, why did you play that trick on me and let my enemy get away safely? Because, Michal answered Saul, he said to me, help me get away or I'll kill you. So the story will continue as David will begin his escape. And the story is colorful as it continues, with people having prophetic visions, including the king. And that leads us back to our psalm and to pulling Psalm 59 together. In its own context, which is the way it's read classically, this is a young David being pursued by a king he has been like a son to. And back to verse 12, do not slay them, lest my people forget. He doesn't ask for the enemy's death. He asks for the bad evil to be ended. His feeling pursued by a pack, howling and prowling. With that, we're straight up at 10, and I look to gain some of your reactions. And again, I could have used the word growl instead of howl. That's how it is in the JPS. Lean home is in modern Hebrew to growl, the word used related here, yini'un. Yilala, technically in modern Hebrew, is howl. So some thoughts on how Psalm 59 resonates for you and how you would entitle it. Hal, go ahead. You got to unmute. I still got to unmute, Hal.
So,
go ahead. Now you've begun. Start from now.
Okay. I like dogs.
Yeah.
There's a distinction made here between the animals who are roaming about for food and growling if they don't get their fill. They're all appetite. But then the word but I will sing. So in other words, the distinction is between animals who are all appetite and we who are spirit or more human, human nature, which brings us closer to God because we have this other quality which separates us from the animal world.
That's very nice. So let me reframe Hal's insight, and that is verse 17, which begins the celebration, begins with "but as for me, va'ani," and that. And what is taking place in 17 and 18 is singing joyfully of God's might. That's a spiritual, reflective expression. In contrast to the dog in the verse immediately before, who wanders for food and cannot fall asleep until it's sated, which is all physical. And the other contrast that occurred to me that you prompt Hal with that comment is that this issue of being able to sleep at night is a very important image. And here, what keeps up the dog again is its stomach. What has kept me up is my enemies, but I will now have a new dawn, meaning I will be able to sleep until the morning, again, 17 and 18, because I trust in God. But that image of the dog is a powerful one. I just want to add Robert Alter, who I value so greatly, with his modern lens, will actually suggest that this verse gets repeated about the dog in verse 15, potentially as a scribal error or as a refrain. He doesn't take his stand, but that's a category for him, scribal error. And I add that as a modern perspective. But for me, 15 and 16, as Howl say, come back for emphasis of contrast between this stomach howl of the dog pack and my ability to trust and rise above my physical needs. Arnold, go ahead, Arnold, and then Ahuva, and then we'll pull it together. Arnold, you got to unmute.
Keep forgetting.
You're there, good.
Verse 12, make these people outcasts. Don't kill them, make them outcasts. Well, outcasts, they can't appear during the day because there will be retribution. They are outcasts. So they are reduced to they are reduced to coming out in the night, and they grovel, they struggle, they to get their food. I mean, they're reduced to the basest existence, and that's what David is. That's what he's saying here, and it's kind of ironic because David was an outcast, and in many respects, he was reduced to living by his wits and coming out in the night and hiding during the day.
That's very well said, Arnold. Let me just say, reframe it for emphasis. David's situation, even in this story of fleeing from Saul, is that he is an outcast. He is a wanderer who has to be discreet about where and when he is seen, leaving him largely to make his moves at night. And so that's a lovely kind of context for the image here of let them wander, let them be like dogs who come out at night howling. So again, that's literally right. Verse 15 and verse 7, they return toward evening as it's getting dark. Nice connections there, Arnold. Thank you. Ahuva, you had raised your hand? Go ahead, Ahuva, unmute.
I noticed a few things in these verses. The word Yehemu that you translated, what, growl or verse 15?
Yes, Yehemu, which can be mutter, it can be growl, howl, make dog sounds. Go ahead.
Because Yehemu, the word lehemot is to create a very soft sound.
Yeah, it's often translated in other contexts to build on Ahuva's insight as mumble. So a soft sound, like a mumbling sound. So here it's applied to dogs, but your point's well taken. Thank you, Ahuva, and I'll let you continue in a second. And that is Yehemu is often a soft sound. Here, howling is a loud sound. So that's a tension. Go ahead, Ahuva.
So we talk about the doves who homiot. It's the same verse, the same descriptive sound that the doves make. So it's very soft, very like maybe cooing. It's the word cooing for the pigeon, for the doves.
Yeah,
It's very soft.
the only thing I would say though is the word lean home. Lean home is understood, which is the same root, to be to growl in a Hebrew dictionary. So you're well taken that in the human context, Yehemu is often, as Ahuva says, a soft sound, a mumbling sound, even a cooing sound. And yet in this context, the Hebrew is also used. That's why JPS will translate it as growling, or others like the Mitsuda, the Orthodox translation, will have it as howling, or Zalman Schachter Shalomi. But a reminder in Ahuva's insight, how context of how words are used can make a big difference. Go ahead, another insight, Ahuva.
In the 16, he described, it's really metaphor, the people who are after him, pursue him. The metaphor is that they're similar to dogs, and
Right.
how they move about in order to, it's not to eat, le'echol, but the meaning is to devour people, the weak, to devour the weak. And if they are not sated, if they are not happy with their hunting, then the word is very interesting. Everyone said vayalinu, and they dwell. How did you put it?
I put it, they may not sleep,
Okay.
using the lo from before for both verbs.
Yeah, I think we can read it vayalinu from meaning lehitlonen means to complain. When they don't get what they want, they are not satisfied, then they complain.
Yeah. So in fact, that's how the Jewish Publication Society translates it, which is whine with a W, right? They whine if they are not satisfied.
Yeah.
But I will add, in reference to your first comment, again, this is for all of us a reminder of how the Hebrew, every translation is an interpretation. So King James, they wander up and down for meat. Rabbinic Robert Alter, they wander in search of food. So there's ambiguity. There is ambiguity. So the last just emphasized, v'yalinu can either be complain, it can also be to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes both ways. That's the nature of Hebrew. One last wordplay, and then I'll pull it together because we're into overtime. And that is, they say somebody, they dog my steps, right? They dog my steps is an expression meaning they follow me very closely. Another, that's a positive image of the dog, as one's companion. But here, this is a psalmist who feels that his steps are dogged by his enemies, moving in a pack, and yet, distinctly here, asks that they not be devoured by God. And yet ambiguity there regarding 12 and 14. I love this psalm in some ways. I love it because it does. I'm looking at Richard, who, on Tuesday shared the discomfort with, or maybe it was last week, with the language of violence in Psalms at times. I'm reassured by the complexity of Psalms as a composite, that there are different moves. I like the move here in verse 12, and I do love the image of the dogs as an image of danger, a pack. With that, next week, we begin Psalms 60, 61, and 62. Those are more celebratory, not as much tied to a historic moment as we were this week with these al tashchetz, do not destroy. They're more positive in lacking that quality of danger in the same degree. With that, we conclude. If anybody needs to say Kaddish, we conclude with the mitzvah of answering Amen for those who do, as I lead. Kaddish Yatom. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, bi'alma divra kirute v'yamlich malchute, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kari v'imru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha barichu. Elah min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran bi'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi shlama Rabba min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'imromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'kol yoshvei tevel v'imru Amen. Thanks to each of you for coming together to study today. Have a good day.